I am going to talk a little bit about our research for those who like to learn about kind of the nuances of the science and the things we're doing. I'm going to try not to get too in the weeds and keep it focused on the clinical trials that we have going on at the NIH. But I'm first going to just talk about what the NIH is in general, because I think I had never heard of it before. I didn't really understand it before I came here, actually. It's definitely not a kind of your typical hospital. So I'll start with that, and then I'll get into the research and the trials that we're doing, both myself and Dr. Thomas at the NIH. What is the NIH Clinical Center? The NIH itself is like a governmental organization that funds all of the research for all medical things throughout the country as far as federal funding goes, and funds the majority of research. But the internal NIH is actually like a completely separate branch where we're an entire hospital and academic campus dedicated solely to research. Everything that's going on in the hospital is involved with research, all of the labs, everything. We don't treat patients who come in off the ER because they're having a heart attack. They should go to a non-research hospital, but everyone, who comes here oftentimes either has a disease where there aren't good treatment options that are currently FDA approved, or there has something that's really rare. And that's a lot of what we do at the NIH. We're in Bethesda, Maryland. So I know a lot of you guys introduced yourself. They're actually not super far, but we're just about 10 minutes over the DC border into Maryland. And we are the world's largest hospital devoted entirely to clinical research across all different disciplines. And so what's it like to actually be a patient here? It's definitely very different from a normal hospital. I think mostly for better and in a few ways for worse. I think we move a little less efficient in terms of, getting things done and moving the day forward. It's probably not a place to come if you're trying to get back to work in an hour. But other than that, I think it's a really special place. Every patient is involved in some kind of clinical trial, and I'll get into more of what that means in a minute. The treatment all is done in Bethesda. There's no cost at all to the patients. Everything is funded through the trial funding, including transportation costs for the patients to get here. And to some extent, like hotel stays, if it's a multi-day treatment, they need to stay in the area, that can be covered or at least heavily discounted as well. Studies can include both treatment, meaning like we're doing an intervention on a patient, such as an actual medication or something like that, or it can be something called natural history, which is where we enroll patients who come and essentially they get sort of a second opinion by seeing us once or twice a year. And then we also we basically just take extra blood and then just learn and keep in touch with you and see how you do for the course of patients' whole lives. And this is a way, just particularly for rarer diseases. We have patients that come with their children and are followed for their whole life for something that's more rare, but we don't actually give any treatments. We're just trying to learn. And then I think the most important thing, the most meaningful thing to me is that we really have a lot more time than typical healthcare systems to dedicate to each patient. The number of patients we have is much lower, and we have a big team, and each appointment's 45 minutes for a return patient. And so we really have the time to sit and talk for long periods of time with our patients. We get to know our patients really, really well. We get emails from, we still get emails from family members of patients who've passed away in the past. And everyone is very close with our team. And to me, that is very fulfilling because I think it's very challenging for oncologists and their support staff, like nurses and stuff in the community, where they're kind of under pressure from their hospital systems to see 30 patients a day who all have cancer and have important discussions to be had. And I feel very fulfilled by the fact that we really do get to spend that time. And our team is amazing. And I think all of them feel very passionately about that as well. So the NIH, this is actually a stock photo of me in the lab that they took when they were doing stock photos for the website. The NIH invests $45 billion every year into medical research, and the largest institute at the NIH is the National Cancer Institute by far. That's kind of the dominant area of research on our campus, although we do a lot of other things too. Every year, there's 6,000 inpatients and 10,000 outpatients taken care of at the NIH Clinical Center, and all of them are participants in a clinical trial. And so, where our focus is really where there's limits to what we call the standard of care therapy. This is an example of pancreas cancer that I think outlines this well. This is the kind of what a doctor sees if you were to pull up what the guidelines are for pancreas cancer. And basically they say for first line therapy, a clinical trial is still preferred to the standard of care therapy. This wouldn't be the case for breast cancer. There's good therapies for breast cancer in the frontline therapy that we know work pretty well. And then maybe later down the line, a clinical trial be recommended. But for some of these cancers that don't have as many good treatment options, a clinical trial is actually recommended by the guidelines from experts in the field. And so that's kind of where we operate, is, where the standard of care isn't great. And so a clinical trial, at least there's the potential for it to be better. I think it goes without saying, it's kind of in this same group with, we don't recommend trials usually in the first line, but certainly in the second line, it's a very good option. And as I mentioned before, there's been called natural history. We do have a natural history study for small cell patients. And patients don't necessarily have to even enroll in a trial for treatment. They can just come and basically see us and meet our team. And we stay closely in touch, and we do some blood draws that way we can do research on. And we usually will also try to get their initial biopsy to do research on. And then we just follow along, and patients, if they then want to enroll later down the line, they can always enroll, but they don't have to. That's one thing that we do. Some groups do standard of care at the NIH. We do not. But we do have things that are combinations of standard of care plus an investigational agent and investigational agents alone. And just to note that when we say an investigational agent, that could be a brand new drug that we're first bringing out of the lab and giving to patients for the first time, or it could be something that's already FDA approved for a different cancer, but we're using it in this cancer for the first time, or we're using it in a new combination for the first time. I would say the majority of our trials fall into that bucket, but our group also does take new drugs to trials as well. So how does it work? Patients are either referred by a physician or they can self-refer. Anyone can email the NIH Medical Oncology Referral Center, and they can help try to see if there's a trial there that you would be eligible for any cancer. We don't have trials for every cancer, but anyone can email it and try to look into it. And then our team screens the patient, make sure that they do have the appropriate, diagnosis. Sometimes we'll have things sent to us that are non-small cell, and we have to say, no, this isn't, not eligible for our group's trials. And then we work on getting the patients here. Sometimes we'll meet via virtually first if patients live far away, and then we coordinate for patients to come out here and eventually start therapy if they consent. And so patients come to the NIH for a lot of reasons: second opinions, just wanting to contribute to research and feeling passionately about that. Most of the patients who come have relapsed or refractory disease when they come for a cancer treatment, especially within our clinic. That's where we are focused. Also, patients without insurance can still be treated here because there is no cost to the patient, and non-US citizens as well are eligible to come and be treated here, regardless of any kind of status that they have. A lot of that at the NIH happens for really rare diseases where there isn't a treatment in someone's home country at all that they can get for their disease. So clinical trial phases, most of ours are phase 1 and phase 2, meaning phase 1, we're really just testing for safety. We're having a new therapy that we're excited about based on research in the lab, but we don't really know that much about it yet. And the goal is just to see what dose we should use and if it's safe. And then in the phase 2, which is where most of our trials are right now, is to see how well it works. So what percentage of patients respond, but it's not being compared to the standard of care. We're just giving every patient, it's not placebo controlled, we're giving every patient the therapy. That's where we're at now. And then phase 3 typically happens outside of the NIH. That's when they are comparing like a placebo controlled or comparing to the standard of care therapy. And that usually happens at multiple centers so that you can get like hundreds and thousands of patients. And so we at that point kind of have other institutes carry on some of the treatments that we look at. So to get into small cell, I don't think I need to convince anyone here that small cell is worth researching and worth funding for research. We know that it's very metastatic, it likes to spread, and it initially is very responsive to chemotherapy, which is always very exciting and positive. But then unfortunately, as I'm sure many of you have experienced, relapse quite quickly in most patients. And really at that point in time, there's 2 approved therapies, topotecan and lurbinectedin. But I think probably everyone would agree that those aren't really satisfactory options. They can have benefit, that's why they're approved, but we really can and should do better than the treatments that we have right now. So why don't we have better treatments for small cell? Non-small cell lung cancer has made a lot. There's been so many advances in non-small cell over the past 10 years or so that has really changed the outcomes for patients with that. But why haven't we been able to do that? And a lot of the reason is just that we don't have a lot of samples of tumor to study. And so, patients with other cancers, breast or non-small cell or colon, they all have surgery when they're at early stages in particular. And so there's all this tumor that that researchers can study and look at, whereas small cell is generally not a surgical disease. It's not a disease where we're resecting out. They get like one tiny little aspirate of a few little cells and they say, oh, they're small cells, we can just move on. But that doesn't really help us to learn about this cancer. And so, for example, the Cancer Genome Atlas and the PCGAWG are two large, basically they put together a ton of sequencing of a ton of different cancers that are accessible for any research team to look at. And these don't include any small cell lung cancer at all. And that's a huge deficit for the ability to find new therapies. And so where we've been at, in the past few decades is that most of our knowledge comes from cell lines and mouse models. Which, as you would imagine, is not reflective of reality for humans. We're very good at killing cancer cells growing in a dish, but that's not reality. That's kind of some of the barriers that have happened in the past. I'll get to kind of Dr. Thomas's philosophy, which he feels very strongly about, but he built his program at the NCI, which I think is certainly one of the biggest small cell programs in the country. And I think we probably see more small cell lung cancer patients than most because that's all that we see. But there was this Recalcitrant Cancer Act of 2012 that required the NCI to develop programs for cancers that are particularly challenging to treat. And so the small cell working group came out of that. And Dr. Thomas has been kind of the lead in the past decade or so. I mean, he's relatively young at the NIH, but has really built up this program. And his philosophy is that first, to give the best possible care for every patient, and second, to learn from every patient. And he feels very strongly about this, that, that research should be patient-centered. And that instead of just, doing all this lab work, and we do use mouse models and we do sometimes use, cell lines to validate some of our findings, but all of our ideas should be coming from the patients themselves and from the tumors that we biopsy from patients that actually reflect reality. His philosophy is really to focus the research. And so he's done, I think this info is outdated. This initially his slide, but at least 15 clinical trials, and we've had over 450 patients enrolled, and definitely more than 250 biopsies at this point. I think this is a little bit outdated, some of these numbers. So now I'm going to get into some of our research, and I'm only going to focus on the research that, for the most part, has led to an active clinical trial. We do a lot of different areas of research and immunotherapy for small cell that we're hoping to have more trials with different immunotherapy areas in the next kind of months to years down the road. So we're doing a lot of behind the scenes stuff on that. And we do have some immunotherapy trials right now. We have some exciting things that we're hoping to come down the pipeline, but right now I'll focus on things that we actively have going on. So first area of research that Dr. Thomas's group in general has done a lot of the findings on is the idea of replication stress and how this can be used to target small cell cancer. Small cell lung cancer is very highly mutated, more than other cancers. The cells are just really messed up. The DNA of the cells is messed up. And in order to survive, it's very reliant on proteins like one called ATR to repair itself so that it doesn't die off on its own from all the mutations that it has. As a result of that, the cancer cells try to divide, then ATR helps repair themselves, and then they continue on living. And so we started trials with this drug called berzosertib, and this was the first ATR inhibitor that came out in research, but there's now like 5 or 6, there's quite a few now that are out in different clinical trials. But the basic idea is that a small cell has all this, what we call replication stress. Normally ATR helps it repair the DNA and then the tumor survives. The idea is if we block it, that it will accumulate all this damage and then die off. And we've seen this in the lab, that this is true, and that of different cancer models, small cell is the most sensitive to this kind of drug. I won't get into the details here, but basically we've done multiple trials with this drug and different combinations. We've shown that it can work in patients. We've had some patients who've had durable responses. It doesn't work for everyone, but that we do have a phase 3 trial going on at multiple centers that hasn't been published yet, but is in the works, that has shown that adding berzosertib to topotecan has better outcomes than topotecan alone. A lot of our trials, we also include non-lung small cell cancers and high-grade neuroendocrine cancers. And If you've never met someone with that, they're very rare. We see a lot of them, but basically they're patients that have the same type of cancer as small cell lung cancer in our microscope, but it comes from somewhere other than the lung. And we're seeing more and more patients with prostate small cell cancer in particular, but it can come from anywhere. And these patients haven't really been studied, and they just kind of get the same treatment as small cell lung cancer. The party line is as soon as you see small cell, you just give them the same treatment as small cell lung cancer, and they're just kind of bucketed in with them. But those patients are often excluded from other trials, and we always have, for the most part, have arms for those trials as well, and we've seen them respond as well. One issue here was that there was a lot of hematologic toxicity, meaning a lot of problems with cell counts getting too low with this combination. And so in order to try to find safer combinations with berzosertib, we've utilized something called antibody drug conjugate, which is already approved for other cancers, breast and bladder. But basically the way it works is it's a special chemo that's attached to an antibody, and the antibody targets the cancer cells more specifically. So the antibody binds to the cancer cells, to a portion of the cancer cells, and then releases the chemo into the cancer cell. And as a result, there's higher concentrations of chemo at the actual tumor and less to the healthy cells. We've published our phase 1 trial here, and we're now doing phase 2 with this combination, and we have seen some promising responses so far. This is actually a patient with small cell prostate cancer who his PET scan, where he had a lot of areas of lighting up that decreased significantly, and he did really well for quite a long time on this trial. And so this is a trial that we still have going on, and we have some others with the ATR inhibitor as well still going on. And then, from this, we're really trying to also, the future plan is to use a lot of the biopsies that we do in our patients to try to find more of those proteins on the surface of the cell that we can find new therapies for, and make more of these antibody drug conjugates, or get into trying to find ways to use immunotherapy like CAR T cells and BiTEs and some of these things that have been used in lymphoma and leukemia, and try to see if this can open up more options down the road. That's the first one. Another area is what we call tumor heterogeneity. And this is a complicated one to tie specifically to a trial, but it's something that one of the reasons that we feel really strongly about getting biopsies on our patients so that we can understand this cancer. Basically, the idea is all the cancer cells aren't identical. If they were, we would have cured everyone's cancer by now, probably. And that would be great. But that's not the case, unfortunately. If this is a tumor, maybe the red cells and the yellow cells are very sensitive to chemotherapy and die off, but the blue cells have something about them that makes them more resistant. And so then on relapse, these tend to grow out more, and we see more of this resistant cancer. And so trying to find ways to eradicate all of these different types of cells at once and try to learn more about how this cancer is a huge part of our work. Additionally, there's a lot of variability between patients. Not every patient with small cell is the same. And, it sounds like there's multiple people on this call who've quote unquote beaten the odds in terms of how long that patients can do and the responses patients can have. And we see those patients, absolutely. But we don't know why they're different and what we can do to make more patients in that category. And so even though we know there's variability, patients all receive the same treatment and outcomes haven't improved in decades. I'm not going to get into the details of this slide because it's a lot of, until like last year, this would have overwhelmed me. But basically our group has really profiled a lot of patients' tumors and found and identified some of these differences and figured out that there's some patients whose profile makes they respond better to immunotherapy, and some patients who respond better to drugs like berzosertib. We try to identify better who would respond to which therapy and give patients therapies that might work better for them. Another issue is that tumors can look different throughout the body. And when we get a biopsy, we're really just looking at one tiny area. And that's what we're going off of. So everyone has one little biopsy, and that's what we've designed all of our small cell therapies on for decades now. And that's not the whole picture. And so one thing we do is, first off, if it's safe to do so, if the patient is willing, we do try to get a biopsy on our patients whenever we can. We don't do anything really invasive, but if someone has a lymph node or like a lung or a liver lesion that's right close to the skin, and we can safely do a biopsy, and someone's willing to, that is really huge for the field to learn. And beyond that, something that we also have is something called a rapid autopsy program, which is something that's difficult to talk about and certainly isn't for everyone. But we do have patients who felt very strongly about participating in this and I think have found a lot of meaning in it. And basically the way it works is we have patients at the end of life come to the NIH and we take care of them. And then after they pass away, we actually do an autopsy where we remove all of their tumor through surgery, the same way you would if you just had a surgery normally. And we do a ton of research on each patient's tumors that way to try to really understand. And it's really a gift. Like, so much is learned from each of these patients. And we're really thankful. We've had 35 patients over the past few years do this. And it's something that is challenging for us to bring up with patients because we do want to focus, on the hope that we can have with trials, which is always the focus. But, the last patient who did this enrolled on it, I think 3 years before he ended up passing away. And he's had small cell cancer for quite a long time. And he felt a lot of fulfillment in doing this and actually put it in his obituary. He wrote that he participated in this. He was something he was really, really proud of. And I think it gave him a lot of meaning. And again, everyone's different. And it's the majority of patients are not interested in this at all. But I did want to put it out there because for the patients who do find meaning in it, I think it is something that's very special and that I didn't think I would enjoy. I thought I was very weary of it when I joined this group, but it's actually been one of the most fulfilling things that I've participated in here. And so then moving on to other research to try to come up with new areas. A big area of my research is trying to figure out what the heck else is going on in the tumor other than the tumor cells, because again, we look at a dish and we just see tumor cells and it's very easy to kill them. But the reality is there's all these other things going on around the cancer cells, blood vessels and scar tissue and immune cells. And this has not really been looked at in small cell at all. And so the reality is that this is what makes it hard to treat. This is what makes immunotherapy not work a lot of the time, is that it creates this barrier and so the immune cells can't get in there. Or it turns them off. And so how can we fix this? Because ultimately we want immunotherapy to work better for small cell. That's really the goal. And so that's something that I'm doing. And so we take a lot of biopsies and do a lot of research with that. And we're hoping eventually to actually have trials that combine drugs that affect the tumor microenvironment too. But this is still in early stages. Another thing that we do with all the blood samples that we get from patients is how can we look at DNA that's floating around in the bloodstream to teach us about cancer so that even when we can't get a biopsy, we can still learn from each patient. And so we're doing a lot with that as well. So these are our currently open trials. I won't go through all of the details of all of them. We have multiple that have a combination of immunotherapies with other drugs that we think might help improve immunotherapy. We have multiple with the berzosertib drug I mentioned before. And then we have our natural history study as well. So, and it's always changing. We always have trials that are opening and coming down the pipeline. And so I think we have a few really exciting ones that I think are very promising that it should be coming out, hopefully within, the next few months or so. And so this is, Dr. Thomas wrote this, editorial in the journal Cancer Cell called Translational Research, a patient-centered approach to bridge the valley of death. And basically just with the idea that, this editorial was written back in 2008 saying, there's all these people doing research and then there's all these doctors treating patients, but the research isn't translating a lot of the time. And that's the valley of death. Like, it's not getting to the patients. It's not always leading to something meaningful. And so, Dr. Thomas feels very strongly, and I agree with him, and it's one of the reasons I joined his group, that the answer to this is to look at the patients, to work with the patients and learn from every single patient that we see to try to find new answers and new hope for patients with small cell. So this is our team. We have our wonderful research nurses and who I think is the best PA in the entire world. And actually, our research nurses are like the best researchers. We have a really wonderful team who are, just extremely compassionate, caring, and just take such above and beyond excellent care of our patients. I feel very strongly about that. And then we have a whole lab behind us and a bunch of other people. And so the NIH is a really special place to work and a special place to take care of patients. And so that's all I have, but I'm happy to talk more about the NIH or about small cell or anything else.
Sure, thank you. Yep, and I agree with you. I know Dr. Thomas, so he is doing great work. I have a question. I see some in the chat. Can you go back to your clinical trials that you have? I know there will be some going down the pike. I know you're going to have some new ones.
Yeah.
But so some of those at the top, is this for, I see, with recurrent small cell?
They're all for extensive stage. So that's a good question. I should have clarified. We don't have any trials for first line. All of our trials are for second line. Patients can enroll in like the natural history study and things like that first line. But right now, everything is for the second line because it is kind of in the phase 1-2 bucket. And so usually you have to show that something works well in the second line setting before you can justify comparing it to the standard of care first line, which we know does work at least for a while. And so that's kind of where the NIH tends to operate, is like in those early stages. And so
okay.
That's where we're at.
Thanks for clarifying. I was curious.
No, I should have clarified that.
This is an excellent way for a patient advocate to play a role in the development of this clinical trial.
Any patient can go on the clinicaltrials.gov website too, but the interface is confusing. Like it's not the most patient friendly, I think.
A lot of clinical trials do not accept patients with brain mets. Do the NCI trials accept small cell lung cancer patients with brain mets?
Very good question. Like I can't speak for every trial at the NCI. For our group, we always accept patients with brain mets. I think it's very hard to do a small cell trial and exclude patients with brain mets because that's not reflective of the disease. We usually there's parameters where patients have to have, if they have a new symptom from their brain met, they need to usually get that addressed. Like it can't be growing and worsening and someone's like getting a numbness or something like that. We'll say, let's talk to your radiation oncologist and see if we can target that one. And then in the process, we'll get you ready and then we'll start therapy. If it's stable and it's there and it's not causing any symptoms, then we move forward regardless. And then once it's been irradiated, if there's a growing one, then we still move forward with therapy. Yeah. We're pretty, I would say overall are compared to some types of cancer where they're sometimes very strict, like just because of the nature of small cell, we are pretty open in terms of who's eligible. We want our trials to reflect the reality of the disease and the patients who have it.
Right. Yeah. Because some clinical trials won't take you if you've even had treatment,
Yeah.
So another question, how quickly can a patient be accepted and treated at the NCI?
Yeah. I would say the minimum, we try to get people in very quickly, especially if they have disease that's progressing. By the time we actually meet someone, usually we can treat them within 1 week would be a best case scenario, but 2 weeks usually we can make happen for sure. Usually I think there's probably a week or so before we can actually get them physically here and get all the record. We need to, get the records, get the pathology sent to us and all of that. So that takes about a week, but it's usually within, I would say 2 to 3 weeks that we do try to get. And if there's a really urgent need where someone's like, time is really of the essence, and we're worried that if we wait too long, that they can become ineligible because of how fit they are or other issues, then we really try to get people in as soon as they're willing to come.
Good. Yeah, that is a quick turnaround.
Yeah.
Here's another question. I have a high-grade neuroendocrine cancer diagnosed December 2020. I'm in the small cell lung cancer treatment bucket, but wondering if research has shown that any of the small cell lung cancer protocols have been more successful in high-grade neuroendocrine treatment.
Yeah, that's a very good question. The short answer is no, but I think it's a complex. I don't think we can definitively say one way or the other because there's so much difference in different high-grade neuroendocrine cancers. There's like patients with high-grade neuroendocrine cancer with the gallbladder and the breast. Like they all get bucketed together, but we don't really, they probably shouldn't be. It's just that based on what we currently know, they are. And so we certainly have had patients. We have a lot of patients we have whole arms on most of our trials for patients with non-lung high-grade neuroendocrine cancers. And we certainly have had patients who've responded to therapies and like individual patients that responded better, but it's hard to say on a global scale because there just aren't enough patients who fit in the same bucket to really answer the question, unfortunately.
Good question.
Yeah, it's a very good question.
Thank you. Dr. Abel, I know that you mentioned earlier that you do not need to have insurance in order to participate, but one thing that you guys mentioned to us, which Dusty and I were very excited about, was the fact that you also pay for travel and food and the expenses. Is that correct? Would you mind sharing a
Yes.
little bit about
Yeah, I can elaborate on that. And I will say our research nurses know a lot more about these nuances than me, but the travel for the patient is paid for. One caveat is that if you have a significant other or a family member that comes with you, if you fly, their flight is not covered. It's just covered for the patient. I think there's ways you can get around it if there's a really high financial need and the patient can't safely travel by themselves. There might be some ways around it. Food is covered. So yeah, travel, they'll fly you out. If we need to delay your flight, they'll do it for you. They just handle it. Sometimes there's exceptions where the first time someone comes out before they're formally on the trial, sometimes patients have to. And if you live over a 90-minute drive or something, or 60, if you're in the DMV area, they usually don't cover gas mileage, but anything beyond into Pennsylvania or anyone that's, I think it's more than 90-minute drive or 90 miles or something like that, then they cover, they reimburse you for the cost of gas if you drive. And then the only exception is most of our trials patients have to stay overnight because it's usually a day 1, day 2 type of regimen. And the hotels are mostly covered, but basically there's a voucher. It doesn't cover the entire cost of the hotel. If there's a really high financial need, we certainly have patients who are extremely high financial need, and then we can get it covered for them fully. And sometimes we get a taxi from the hotel to here, so that's all taken care of.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I have another question in the chat. Does the NIH cooperate with other hospitals on their trial?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. That's actually a key. So we always have, when patients come to us, they don't stop seeing their local oncologist. We have them continue to see them. They don't have to see them as regularly, but we do have them check in. We usually will email back and forth. And it's always great when there's an oncologist that's very communicative with us too. And, if there's any updates, we contact them right away. And if the trial were to stop working, we have multiple trials. Sometimes we'll recommend another, but if not, we can also work with their oncologist to transition back to a treatment with their oncologist locally. And if patients are traveling, we also need someone there if there's a complication or a side effect that comes up and you need IV fluids or you need something, you don't want to you're not going to drive 4 hours or however long to get to the NIH. You need to be able to be seen by your oncologist who knows you there and before you can come see us again, just for safety.
And if someone's newly diagnosed, say they're looking for a trial, and I look on today, Thursday, then maybe 2 weeks go by, how often is this updated that you have these trials coming up on your website so we could see?
On our website?
Or if we're finding you're enrolling, in a new clinical.
Oh, on clinicaltrials.gov? I actually don't know. I think they probably update very quickly. I actually don't know the answer to that though. I think it'll be another few months before one of our trials that I'm excited about is we're just waiting for drug company paperwork. So it's just bureaucracy that we're waiting on at the moment, but it should come up. I would assume it comes up very quickly as soon as it's approved.
Okay.
Someone also had asked about participation in the rapid autopsy if you're not a patient at the NIH. Yes. Anyone with this diagnosis can participate. And we have had patients who we haven't ever treated who've participated.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else have a question? Oh, good. Okay. So you have a tumor bank there that you are?
Yeah, we have a very large tumor bank that I don't know if it's the largest, but it might be. Probably the group at MSK and MD Anderson probably also have large ones, but this is in the world of research, a lot of other areas of research, people can be kind of competitive. It's oh, this is, they don't want anyone else to get their precious research. And that's just not how the small cell world is at all. Everyone's oh, yes, you want to collaborate on this? We want to put all of our info together, whatever it takes. But we have a very large tumor bank and so much, we have so much to learn just from all of the tumors that we have, the sequencing results that we have. The biggest backlog is just getting people who can do the research on it. Actually, there's just so much data that needs to be kind of untangled. And so that's where a lot of our work is right now.
Awesome. Any other questions?
What is the process for Canadian patients? Yes, we have had Canadian patients before. A lot of the heme malignancies groups have patients from we have patients that get bone marrow transplanted here from Africa, the Caribbean, South America. We had a few people come from Ukraine when the war broke out. So Canada is relatively easy to manage, I think. Sometimes there are still hiccups, but in terms of getting people here, but I don't actually know the nuances because it's not something that I personally deal with. But if you reach out to us, like we can, if someone is interested, it would not be a problem. It just might be a little bit more paperwork.